Okay, so we're gonna basically sort of explore these issues from the kind of global scale, thinking about how sort of biomass and nets are in things like integrated assessment models. We're going to go down through the sort of national scale and policy, all the way down really to the sort of farm scale and the sort of barriers that there might be that there in terms of implementing these policies. And we're going to look at, you know, the sort of the techno-economic side, I suppose, and all the way through to the sort of social aspects of and the issues around there. So hopefully that will be the sort of first half of the session, and then use the Glisser platform to post your questions for our panel, who will then sort of discuss the issues which arise even. So we're going to kick off with Dr. Oliver Broad from University College London.
Thank you very much. Good morning. So slides are not yet up. Am I supposed to? There we go. A bit rusty. This is the first conference I've been to in a while. So it's a pleasure to be up here and to sort of launch this session on biomass. And I'm going to be talking about a modeling perspective on biomass. So I'm an energy modeler by practice and an energy engineer by training. And I've been asked to provide a bit of a system focus, sort of taking a step back and thinking about the services, the wider energy system, where biomass fits in, where we think it's going to fit in, how that thought process has changed a little bit over time, provide a bit of a global context, a bit of a UK context, so, you know, very specific things, and to try and talk about the net zero implementation gap along the way, giving an overview of messaging around, so negative energy technologies, that's nets, and biomass with energy, carbon capture and storage, BECCS. So what I want to talk about today is following a slight narrative. So I'm going to go through these throughout the slides, and I want to sort of just take you on a little bit of a journey, saying things along these lines. So first of all, it appears pretty clear that we're going to require a certain amount of BECCS to reach net zero. And by pretty clear, I mean the net zero strategy expects 52 to 58 megatons by 2050. So they're very specific on the numbers. And we expect that to cover quite a wide range of different uses. But the exact amount, the exact location of the use of biomass and BECCS is still rather uncertain. And depending on how you do the modeling and how you do the work, it pops up in different ways. And we'll look at that a little bit later. We typically expect it to be in hard-to-abate sectors, but that, again, shifts around. And it shifts around for a number of reasons. It shifts around depending on how you look at the future and how you think of other alternatives. And it shifts around depending on how you think of your future strategy. Particularly, it starts to shift when you consider alternative options to reduce emissions and to think about future emission targets that we have. And so basically, one of the elements that I want to focus on as well is what we can do in immediate terms in terms of reaching our targets and how modeling looks at that. So to kick us off, the first point that I want to get across is that it seems quite clear that we're going to need a certain amount of BECCS and negative emission technologies to get where we need to go. On the left-hand side of this graphic, I've taken a graph from AR6 mitigation pathways, working group 3 from the IPCC. And what we see here is from the summary for policymakers. And it shows model mitigation pathways that limit global warming to 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. And they involve deep, rapid, and sustained emission reductions. Particularly looking at the blue and purple sections, you can see that they go net negative at different periods in time. And that relates to the use of BECCS, up to between 30 and 780 gigatons in cumulative emissions savings over the period, and DACs, up to 310 gigatons over the same period to reach 1.5 degrees with about 50% chances of getting there. So that's a global picture. When we look on the UK side, the picture's the expectations are mirrored in the sense, so thinking about the CCC's modeling and the CCC work, which is presented here, they look at a variety of different scenarios. They've got 5 different scenarios in their advice to Carbon Budget 6. The blue shades that you see are different versions of biomass with carbon capture and storage, with a bit of DAC at the end in grey. And the lines represent the different scenarios that they represented. And basically, they range from 45 to 110 megatons savings or net removals per year by 2050. So again, quite a wide range, but a definite need for removals to be present. Their balanced pathway accumulates up to 685 megatons of CO2, starting as early as 2025. So we're running out of time. To put it into context of the net zero strategy, the strategy expects CCS to be providing 20 to 30 megatons by 2030, of which 5 megatons would be negative removals. So 2030 capture, of which 5 would be actual net removals. So again, pretty ambitious targets coming up rather fast. But so where does this actually sit in the energy system? Well, the answer isn't completely clear. And it's not clear because it varies depending on what you think the energy system is going to look like in the future and what you think people are going to need and how the system's going to develop. Again, taking information from the Committee on Climate Change, looking at different pathways for biomass and waste consumption in the UK in 2050, quoting from the Committee on Climate Change, demand for bioenergy and waste vary considerably across the exploratory scenarios, with a range for total primary bioenergy supplies used in 2050 between 210 and 390 terawatt hours per year. So quite a wide range. Continuing the quote, this reflects different mixes of feedstock, conversion technologies, end-use solutions, with the roles of BECCS power and BECCS hydrogen contributing the largest. So we're starting to see a certain sector focus, BECCS power and BECCS hydrogen being important. But if we focus on two key scenarios here, for example, the widespread engagement, which is the middle one, and the tailwinds, we can see that there's a particularly wide range of potentials that we may be required to use in the UK, and particularly certain sectors appearing or disappearing depending on how you think the system's going to develop and what your needs are going to be. The green bar that disappears is fuel supply, which loosely translates to hydrogen. So essentially, depending on how you think about the future, it can lead to a doubling of your annual use of biomass in the system. And the important thing that we heard about this morning when we're thinking about infrastructure is that this trickles down to implications for the energy system in physical terms. We need to be supplying that biomass across supply chains. We need to be designing the systems that are going to use the fuels produced. These have long lead times and have very strong implications for what it is that we're actually going to need to build. So why is it that we don't quite know? Well, part of the issue over time has been that the picture for negative emission technologies and BECCS has changed because we've changed how we've modeled it. So looking left, this is from 2018, IPCC's special report on 1.5. And this represents the typologies of scenarios that were looked at. And what you can see is that we've got a very big difference between typology P4, I'm going to come back in a second, and 1 through 3. 1 through 3 look at limited overshoot. Pathway 4 allows you to delay your action and to overshoot a little bit in terms of emissions and to then recoup it later on in the century. And this relies heavily on the yellow being removed at the bottom, and that's pure BECCS in their analysis at the time. Now, when we look to the right, IPCC AR6, so 4 years later, a similar approach looking at a similar range of scenarios by similar models, they've taken on board certain criticisms about bioenergy and biomass, and they've started to diversify how they represent the emissions related to it, how they represent the technologies using it, and how they represent alternative solutions. And suddenly we can start to see a diversity of options popping in. So in the middle is afforestation and land use emission sequestration. And the black lines in this represent the median across all scenarios. So first of all, we can see that, well, it's hard to see, but I can take it on face value. The amount has doubled compared to AR5. And when we look across BECCS compared to DAX, first of all, DAX wasn't in AR5 previously. It's suddenly there and taking up, depending on the scenario, significant amounts of removals. And essentially showing that while the overall sequestration between AR5 and AR6 are comparable, suddenly the share across different options has started to shift and change. And that's the global picture. Thinking about the UK, sorry. That was the global picture, and following on with the global picture, the reason that some of this is changing is that we think about the future following different strategies, and we think about it in different ways. This shows, from IPCC analysis again, 5 representative scenarios of future energy use. It shows CO2 consumption and non-CO2 emissions and consumption, so sinks and removals at the time of net zero CO2. And it shows that focusing our efforts on different priorities will lead to different outcomes. What I mean by this is that if we consider two of these scenarios specifically, so IMP LD, which is low demand, and IMP SP, which is shifting the pathways, these representative scenarios focus specifically on reducing consumption globally, leading to lower demands for resource, while still ensuring high services and high quality of life and availability of basic needs. And the shifting pathways considers moving towards sustainable development as a focus, focusing rather on reducing inequalities rather than purely on removals and CO2, and leading to mitigation that way. And what we see in these two scenarios is that they are the two scenarios that have the lowest amounts of sinks involved, and in the low demand, there's no actual negative emission technologies. There's only natural systems involved in removing that CO2. Comparatively, if we focus on negative emissions, which is the IMP neg, as a solution and put all of our efforts into that solution as the key to reaching the targets that we have, the image looks completely different, and we have very high levels of technology involved in producing the negative emissions that we need. This picture on a global scale is mirrored also on a UK scale. If we do analysis for the UK, and we did this at UCL looking at the role of biomass with carbon capture and storage in the UK, you can get very similar dynamics. Depending on how you think the future is going to unfold and how you think the energy needs are going to develop in the country, your use of biomass, your role for negative energy technologies, and the role of BECCS shifts quite significantly. So on this, what we see on the left-hand side is different levels of CO2 removal required across different pathways that we've developed to get to net zero. These pathways include net zero as a reference case, which mirrors the CCC approach, engineered removal focus, a focus on lower availability of biomass, a focus on reduced removals where technology develops more slowly, and a focus on lowering demand as an element of reducing pressure. And essentially what we see is that, again, the use of biomass can shift tremendously from very high levels in power and hydrogen generation when we focus on technology, and mirrored by very high levels of carbon capture that allow high levels of consumption in society and high levels of energy use. Conversely, in a reduced removal situation where technology develops late, or there are issues along supply chains which are complex and don't yet exist, so it's not an unreasonable approach to take, we fall short of the targets that we expect to get to because we rely too much on those approaches and end up not being able to reach the targets that we have. Finally, limiting demand reduces the pressure on the system, still relies on biomass. Biomass is still used in BECCS for power and for hydrogen, just at lower levels. And we rely heavily, again, on natural systems to provide other negative emission removals. So the message really here is that the way that we look at the system and the way that we use the models to understand how we get there conditions a little bit how we use the biomass and how CCS and nets come into the picture. I wanted to finish with this slide, which is a reworked version of another IPCC graphic that looks at mitigation options, highlighting their cost, that's the color that you see on the graphic, and their potential, so the length of the bar, how much we can actually remove in gigatons per year. This is a global picture. And I think I see several messages here. First of all, there's a lot that we could, this is a 2030 picture. There's a lot we can do by 2030 in terms of mitigation. There are a lot of options that we can pursue. There's a lot of things that we can do. Biomass and BECCS and negative emission technologies are part of this, definitely. But a large share of these options are also different from the options that we've been talking about. There's a large range of these potentials that are at the lower end of the cost bracket and that have got very high levels of potential. And these are renewables, reduced conversion of natural ecosystems, soil restoration and soil health focus, or afforestation, reforestation. These are all at the top level. Admittedly, there's a high error bar attached to these, but equally, they're still considered to be worth very high levels of focus when we're thinking about reaching the targets that we've set ourselves. So coming to the end of this discussion, trying to give, in a very short amount of time, a broad overview of what the discussion when we're thinking about modeling and nets and BECCS involved, where do we think things are going and why, I wanted to kind of reaffirm some of the thoughts that I led in with. So they are going to be critical for reaching the targets that we have, definitely. There's very little doubt, considering how fast we're moving forward and what scenarios seem to be showing that we're going to get there without that. Nevertheless, they're one technology or one set of technologies among a basket of approaches which allow us to get to where we need to be. And betting on a single system increases risk heavily rather than diversifying that risk by applying a larger number of different methods. So ultimately, I think that the idea that I wanted to open up with this is that while developing these understandings that we have and growing better understanding that we need about these systems and how to include them in our analytics to make our understanding better and more refined, there are things that we can do now to reduce emissions, and we should be focusing on those. So we heard about, reducing emission or reducing demand earlier on by some other speakers, and I think I wholeheartedly agree with that as one option. We need to be having those conversations and discussing alternatives, having the difficult discussions about what we do in the immediate term, and thinking about where we're going to get the negative emission technologies and BECCS to balance across the remaining system in a way that's planned and in a way that's sustainable. Ooh. Thank you very much.
Oh, that was perfectly timed.
Wasn't it just?
Yeah, it's very good. Follow that. Right, okay, well, our next speaker is Patricia Thornley. She is based at Aston University, the director of EBRI, but also the lead on the Supergem Bioenergy Hub. So, Patricia.
Okay. Morning, everyone. Lovely to be back at a UKIRK event. This is like the third real person event I've been to recently, but it is so long since I've been to a UKIRK one. I love UKIRK because it's all whole systems. I love whole systems. I love being able to go in and sit at the back of the room and listen to stuff that I know absolutely nothing about and think, oh, that makes sense, or I can learn a bit there and we can join things up. And actually, that's what BECCS is all about. That's what biomass and bioenergy is all about. It is such an incredibly interdisciplinary space, it's unreal. You end up looking at stuff in far-flung corners of the world, needing to know all about soil. And then you need to know about CO2 sequestration, and you need to know all the chemical processing in between. It's really quite incredible. And when we're doing that, like I say, I love the interdisciplinary element. I get the whole systems focus that you guys have. I think that's really important. But we also need experts. I need to work with people who understand what exactly is happening to the carbon when it goes down into the soil, and what are the microbial communities doing, and why does that mean it will stay there for longer or for less time at different points? I could give you so many examples along the chain. So in Supergen, what we do is we divide this into 3 lumps. We talk about resources, we talk about conversion technologies, and we talk about vectors. So that's the what am I turning it into that is displacing what people use today: gas, energy fuel, electricity, aviation fuel. Doesn't matter what it is, but that's what we look at. Before I was in academia, I worked in the commercial sector on quite a few biomass facilities. And every time we had a problem in the real world in implementing these, and this still happens today, it's not in the bit that the experts have control of. It's at the interfaces that happen between these. So I think, what UKIRK does, great, because we need that whole systems understanding. We need to get on top of those interfaces. But in biomass and bioenergy, we've sort of started well a long time ago, when I was early on in my career, and we did an awful lot of implementation, and many people probably don't realize that roughly half of the renewables last year, renewable electricity last year that was delivered was from biomass. Most of it's hidden away in large facilities like Drax. But it's a really complex system, and trying to continue innovating around that when you have the sort of complexities that we were just being shown by Oliver, oh, I want this year, and 2 years later I've changed my mind, I want something that looks like this instead, isn't really terribly helpful. So, what I think we've seen in probably the last 10 years is literally a paralysis of the industry caused by us making it too complicated. So what I am suggesting today is that we need to retain that whole systems overview, because if I don't do that, I can't actually prove it was net negative, and that is beyond important. But we need to chunk this up a bit. And I like how we do it in Supergen. I've been doing it like that for 10 years. And I think we need to detach the different bits of the system. We call it a semi-detached framework. And I think we need to stop wasting our time trying to endlessly prove and calculate things that actually are part of the natural world and will vary anyway. I saw the size of your error bars. What is the point in trying to, spend 3 years of a PhD defining that number when we all know it's plus or minus 100%? Totally pointless exercise. So what we're promoting is the concept of a semi-detached framework where we chunk up the 3 bits into the stuff that we actually can be experts on and know about, and we make that semi-quantitative. There is stuff that's good, that's always good. There is stuff that's sort of sitting around the middle, and there's stuff that's frankly a bad idea and should be banned. So we try and stick it out like that, semi-detached, semi-quantitative. The really key thing about that is that I come back to the fact that this all needs to deploy in the real world with commercial implementation. What that allows us to do is to put the contractual responsibility and incentivization with the parties that are best able to deal with it. And that's how we manage risk in this system, where you could be doing something very good or you could be doing something very bad. So I think the first thing we need to do is start with the feedstock. No, we don't. We need to start by actually deciding what we want, because for far too long people have said, oh, biomass, lovely, that can do carbon, that can do negative carbon, oh, and some ecosystem benefits, and some biodiversity, and lots of other stuff. This is the current problem with what's going on with the England Tree Action Plan, that we have started talking about carbon, the Nature for Climate Fund, and instead we've turned it into something that we want to deliver on biodiversity and ecosystems. I say this conscious that there are people in the room who know more about this than I do. But, we need to agree what our carbon metric is. Is it the global carbon emissions, or is it what sits on the UK's balance sheet? Because then we need to think differently about what we import from elsewhere. We need to think about sequestration differently. So let's start by getting a carbon metric we can all sign up to and saying, okay, that's what we want biomass to do. We then need to look at the resource. And we need to take that carbon metric and calculate what the embodied carbon was in producing this resource in a way that, again, we can all agree on. And sure, there might be an error bar, but it's the best we can do. If we actually label that and get some liquidity into the market around the feedstock trading by saying, you know what, I can buy that one for 100 quid a tonne, and it's got an embodied carbon of 55 kilograms per tonne, or I can buy that one for 200 quid a tonne, but it's got a much better embodied carbon, and I can get a market set up around that, then we can start to value and incentivize the producers to do the right thing without having big complex supply chains and frameworks where we go and check on this. So we need to label the carbon in the feedstock, we need to trade it accordingly. Then you've got the difficult bit around conversion systems, and I've spent a huge part of my career trying to innovate on this and move things up. And one of the problems here is you want to encourage people to go to the next level, to do it a bit more efficiently, and that's risky. And it's really hard to get the banks and the investors to agree to that. It works on paper, but it may not work when you build it. I've also done the auditing of these plants when they're built, and I've seen 2 things. I've seen plants that don't live up to what the owner thought they were going to do, and I've seen owners who pretended to everyone that they knew what it was going to do when actually they knew it was nowhere near that and was nothing like that. Both are problems, but I'm going to argue that the first problem, where we're actually trying to move forward genuinely, and we have a design that we believe will be better, should be supported. As a nation, we should be trying to do that, to advance the technology and push it forward. So I think we need to take our conversion technology as designed, check it is built as designed, and then work with that as our basis around whether this conversion technology is good, bad, or indifferent. So essentially, we assess the planned efficiency, not the delivered. We look at the delivered, but we have to understand that this is innovation and there is a risk there. The final thing is where you send this stuff. Electricity, heat, aviation fuel, whatever. The problem is that developers don't have any control over this. They are absolutely the worst people to mitigate that risk. The people who are best at mitigating that risk is a combination of the different government departments who should actually have oversight of what they're trying to do in heating and whether we really need a low carbon gas supply or whether we'd be better off putting this into aviation fuels. So I think we need a benchmark of carbon intensities in the sector that aren't biomass, and they are the best that can be achieved in heat, in electricity, in whatever. If we set that up as what those vectors can do, then we can all plan. We can take the feedstock that we purchase with the known carbon intensity on it. We can take the plant that we've designed with its efficiency that we're expecting wholeheartedly to get, and we can work out whether that's going to achieve the benchmark that government is setting us in, let's say, a 5-year forward plan or 5-year segments, in much the same way that we have with the carbon budgets, the Committee on Climate Change. If we can benchmark that in a semi-quantitative way, and I'm going to go as simple as high, medium, and low for each of those, then we can actually assess what a good bioenergy or biomass or bioproduct system looks like. And it does need to be consistent across the piece. And I think that is the way that we need to move forward. We need to stop the paralysis of going, oh, well, we can't possibly start growing anything until we're absolutely certain that we've got a path and a route and we've made the economic case for the end bit. And we need to stop trying to disincentivize innovation by not allowing people to try risky things where it could actually give us carbon benefits. And we need to start rewarding the people who are growing stuff that is doing the right thing. And that is what I'm hoping comes out of the Biomass Strategy.
Thanks a lot.
Just a reminder to keep your questions coming.
Our next speaker is Rebecca Rowe from Centre for Ecology and Hydrology.
I'm going to take us back down. So we've done the sort of, well, all of us done the sort of national, international scale. So I've been asked to look a bit more of the UK scale. So specifically, I'm going to look at perennial biomass crops and the land use decision making at the field scale. So as I say, I'm actually part of the Supergen Bioenergy Hub, but I actually work at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. So let's see if this goes the right way. It does. So to meet our net zero targets, what we need in the UK at the moment, or potentially, is for landowners to plant bioenergy crops, preferably sustainably. So the CCC6 carbon budget, so their net balance zero pathway that Oliver mentioned, requires us a dramatic increase in the amount of perennial bioenergy crops in the UK. So that's things like miscanthus, short rotation coppice willow, short rotation forestry. So these are long-term bioenergy crops in the ground for sort of 15 years. These are not your annual crops. At the moment, we have around 10,000 hectares of them. By 2050, the target for that, to meet that, in order to supply all that lovely material for BECCS, is around 70,000 hectares, and that's in the UK. That's our UK argument. That's not including imports. So in order to get there, obviously, we've got some barriers. So we need to understand why these crops are not getting planted. So what are the barriers to perennial biocrop expansion? And we also need to know where in the UK these crops should be planted. And that's because where we put them has a dramatic impact on the ecosystem services we can get from them. So those two things we needed to understand. So as part of the Supergen Bioenergy Hub, I decided, well, with my colleagues, to have a look at this. So to achieve this target, we held a workshop early in January to bring together people from academia, from government, from industry, and those industry, both end users and companies involved in the planting, and so companies involved in helping growers to plant and harvest their biomass and then link them up with the end users. We also had a couple of NGOs and some research councils there as well, so 74 people in total. I'm also drawing on some work that Anita Shepp has done. She's a fellow within Supergen, where she's done a survey of UK miscanthus growers, looking at what they think the benefits and drawbacks of that miscanthus crop is for them. She's supported that by Rebecca von Helfeld, which I must say correctly, I'm trying to. So in terms of the barriers, so we asked our workshop participants to put them into little breakout rooms. It's all online. They filled out their opinions and their comments onto boards. We then collected all of those and dropped them into, sort of categorized them into however many categories they fell into. In this case, 23 different barriers were identified, or classes of barriers. They broadly fell into economic, policy, people, and technical barriers. We also got them to vote on what of those, so of everything that was brought in the workshop, we brought those together. Then at the end of the workshop, we asked people to vote on what their top 5 were of those barriers across all of those groups. So we got not only what they were, but what were the most important ones to them in terms of the barrier for biomass crop deployment in the UK. So we have the top 5 all came out in the economic and policy barriers. So probably not that surprising. So economic attractiveness, long-term economic security, market maturity, and then synergy cost policy framework and a stable policy framework. So I'll go over these. And these might sound very familiar to some of the things being brought up in the other sessions around what the issues we have about policy. But in terms of economic attractiveness, so the point here was that farmers will not currently grow the crops if it doesn't pay them money. And they're actually looking not only at what these crops, the equivalent food crops, they're looking at all food and non-food uses of that land. So whatever they're looking at purchasing or using for that land, it's what is the economic barrier. This actually has a positive effect as well as a negative one. At the moment, bioenergy crops are not really able to compete with food crops on high-value land that is not otherwise constrained. So there is a bit of concern that bioenergy crops will place food crops. Certainly in the UK at the current market, if you have a high productive land that's got a very good value for food crops, it is highly unlikely that you'll be therefore planting biomass crops on it because it simply won't pay you to do it unless you have another constraint. So unless your land floods or maybe there's the field's too far away or it's too small, it's too rocky, those sort of things, then you will. Otherwise, you probably won't. So some of that concern is probably mitigated. That will change as we change the economic situation. Long-term energy economic security and the market maturity, these work both ways for both the people growing and the end users. So these crops in the ground for somewhere between 15 and 25 years once you plant them. You need to know who you are going to be, who's going to be buying your crop and at what price they're going to be buying your crop long term. So you need to know not necessarily who your end user is, but what that price is like to be. The market in the UK is also extremely small at the moment. We only have a few end users, it's immature, and because of that, there is uncertainty from growers about whether they should plant the crop because who are they going to sell to, and if their end user goes bankrupt, who else are they going to sell to? And this has been a problem with individual end user companies, power stations, changing what they're taking, and therefore landowners being left with a crop that they're having difficulty in selling. It also works the other way, though. For an end user in the UK, if they're looking to supply themselves with biomass, if the market's not very mature, they don't have a lot of options. This is beginning to change, but this at the moment is a big issue. So we need to actually incentivize both sides. There's no point incentivizing people to plant the crop if we don't also look at making sure there's an end user demand, whether that be for energy or other uses of that biomass. One of the big economic costs was actually related to transport. So this is one that came up in the survey done by Anita as well. And this isn't just about getting your crop from your field to the end user. This is also about getting the harvest machinery, which is specialized, to the farm in order to do the planting and harvesting. Because the market's so small, there's only a few of that equipment available, it can be quite a lot if you've got crops distributed across the UK. So at the moment, that transport cost is actually a big issue. Strangely enough, the planting costs that used to have a grant involved, so there used to be a grant for planting bioenergy crops, that wasn't a big issue. There's only a few people that mentioned that, and actually it's more the transport costs and things like the overall economic attractiveness and that security that are bigger issues than that planting cost. So we need to think about that in terms of policy. That may not be the best target. Then we go on to the policy barriers, where everyone got quite irate. So in terms of the things, synergy across policy frameworks and stable policy frameworks, these were both brought up not only by our industry and our NGOs, but also by the government stakeholders involved as well. They also saw this as a problem. So the issue with this is that there is a lot of people making policy that's related to bioenergy. So it comes out of DEFRA, it comes out of BEIS. We had devolved governments there. We had Welsh and Scottish government representatives as well. They're all having different policies, and not all of those are joined up. There's issues at the moment with the afforestation policy in the UK, where farmers at the moment can get payments to a forest, but there isn't a similar system available at the moment for biomass crops, and they are different strategies in the CCC report. There's a different target for afforestation than there is for biomass crops. That doesn't mean they should be competing, but if there's only one policy available at the moment, people involved in the biomass industry are kind of feeling like they're not wanted or they're not getting that sort of clear messaging from government. There is a clear role for biomass in the future. That's partly because the strategy is still under development, but that can have a negative result. The stable policy framework, this was pointed out in terms of energy efficiency in the talk I said earlier. The policy around biomass has changed repeatedly. So there's been planting grants that have come and gone. There's been subsidies for end users that have come and gone. That's left a negative perception within the industry about what the actual long-term future is with the crop. There's been issues where people have planted and not had a long-term thing. So that stability going forward is really, really important. However, there was also an understanding that these crops do need some sort of targeted intervention at the moment. They are not at the moment capable of existing without some sort of policy support. Although how we do that is quite sensitive, I think. So in terms of the other barriers, just because I thought we might as well do all of them. So these didn't come up in the top 5, but there were a lot of comments around them, so I thought it was worth mentioning them. So there's people barriers and technical barriers. So people barriers, the main thing that came up is that communication of the benefits and the opportunities. So biomass energy crops and biomass usage is actually quite a complex story. It's not something that's very easy, and there's lots of issues around like soil carbon sequestration, the carbon story, why it's renewable, even people understanding that burning a tree is okay, that it's not a bad thing to do. And that's led to a lot of negative public perceptions and cultural barriers. That means that farmers and landowners are reluctant, and also policymakers. And what there was is a need for partnership was highlighted, that we need to get together with academics, industry and policymakers to have clear messaging that we're all saying that not necessarily the same story, because we don't all have to agree, but that we're understanding, making a clear message about the benefits and the negative potentials of these crops. And that is being clearly and simplistically given out to the public so that we can get some sort of social buy-in. There's also barriers that noted around research gaps. So this was partly from the policymakers saying there's still some uncertainty around the ecosystem service delivery of some of these crops. Partly that might be, again, a messaging issue. But again, there's a research gap that they were feeling there that made them potentially making them more reluctant to make policy. One of the other big ones was equipment and infrastructure. So at the moment, we simply don't have enough planting material. That's just material to plant in the ground, to scale that up in order to hit those planting targets. Decision support tools, and skills and experience. These are new crops for both the growers and land users, but also for some end users. So the understanding of the skills and experience necessary to utilise those crops are also still barriers at the moment that need to be overcome. So I'm just going to quickly run over the criteria all in one. But again, the same process. We asked everyone to make their points. We grouped them together. They fell under economic, environmental and social criteria. There were some other points that are in there. And again, we picked out those top 5 in order to do. So there's a lot of repeating, you'll notice, from the barriers and actually the criteria. But there was a distinct split here, which I think is probably interesting. So for our industry partners, the 5 that came at the top were net profit, proximity to the end user contractors, the net carbon gain, net ecosystem service, and the biodiversity. So they were the top 5. However, there was a clear split. For our industry partners, that net profit and that proximity to the end user contractors, the economic ones, were the top ones. They were basically saying, if this crop does not make a profit, it is not going to get planted, which is fairly obvious. So the criteria for selecting where in the UK we should put them, the primary thing that you're going to have to look at is where is the crop going to turn a profit in comparison to an alternative land use. And one of the things that came out, again, was that transport, and it's at proximity to the end user and the contractor. But that's a transport cost. If you can get that transport cost down, you could put the crops in more diverse points. Or if you had a diverse system where you have local usage, you could therefore that transport cost. So it's about making those links when you're doing any modelling work. For the environmental criteria, now this was predominated by the academics, the NGOs and the policymakers. These are the ones that felt these were the most important criteria. Net carbon gain, so that includes your offsetting for using the biomass, not all about your soil carbon, which makes me happy. Despite the fact I work on soil carbon, I think we should be looking at the net carbon gain of the crop, not just its soil carbon impact. Net ecosystem services, so that was people who made comments that covered everything from flooding to biodiversity. And biodiversity was hitting quite high as well. I think that might be especially because of that forestry that you were talking about, how that forestry thing has slipped away from net C to biodiversity. I think that's also happening across bioenergy crops. These crops can have biodiversity benefits, but I think we need to be careful that we're not planting them because of that, when the main reason of planting them is they are energy crops that are supposed to be, or biomass crops, that are an alternative fuel or biomass source for low carbon products. The social criteria are actually quite interesting as well, in terms of this is more about social license to operate. So these were things around the community value of the land and local wealth. So if we want to put the crops in the ground, understanding how the community is currently using that land is probably one of the most important things to do in order to get a public license to operate. And farmers or landowners, according to the industry, are sensitive to this. and that was picked up in Anita's work, that actually some of the farmers were considering things like, oh, my neighbours don't like it when I spray that field, so I put bioenergy crops in because I don't have to spray them. So that input from the local community does have an influence on some of the land owners' decision-making processes. And it also has an influence on the public perception and therefore the policy makers' perception of the crop. So understanding how a community is using their land, and also if you can link in local wealth. So if there is a link, if the end user is close to the biomass crop and people can see the value to the local community or local energy supply, you're more likely to get a social license to operate. That doesn't mean you necessarily should have to do that all the time, but these were things that were picked up in there. Things like food system interactions weren't around offsetting or concerns about food. That was more about, is there a benefit where you might have a food waste supply coming in, or where you might have advanced users using bioenergy crops to buffer. If you've got a food crop that can be both a biomass crop and a energy crop, can you use that to buffer some of those interactions? One of the other points, the reason marginal land is crossed out, that was in the other category. The use of the term marginal land is used a lot in policy. We should use marginal land for bioenergy crop deployment because it avoids competition with food. It's like we commonly say. Farmers don't like that term, that was industry partners say to us, because they do not consider their land to be marginal. They might consider lower productivity, but it's almost an offensive term to them. It's also not very helpful, because everybody has a different definition of what a marginal land is. It's an ill-defined term. What we're really talking about is land that's suitable for bioenergy cropping. And actually the term marginal is so ill-defined, it's actually unhelpful. So that was the feedback we got, is will you please stop using it? And other people are like, oh, you can use it, but you have to add in all these other categories into it because it doesn't cover all the things it should cover. So I think we need to think about what we actually mean about where we should put these crops. It's about land that's suitable rather than land that's necessarily marginal. So a quick in conclusion, we know that landowners, policymakers, NGOs and local communities are actually the gatekeepers who can turn net zero aspirations into reality. If we want to get these crops in the ground in order to hit those targets, those are the people we need to convince. So as researchers, which I am, we can help evidence sustainable pathways and remove knowledge gaps that helps give our policymakers and our industry confidence in what they're doing is the right solution, or at least good enough. And we need synergies across policy, and clear messaging across all stakeholders can increase confidence and remove barriers. A lot of the barriers are actually just purely about confidence. But at the end of the day, it's the people that are going to plant these crops, and we actually need to look at co-development. So if we want this to work properly, if we need to co-develop our research targets and our activities with the people that are actually involved in planting the crops to ensure we're actually answering their questions. A third bit we had in this workshop was around actually what people needed in terms of tools. And a lot of the tools we're developing don't actually necessarily align with what people need. Just so that's my contact details. There will be a copy of the full workshop report on the SuperGen website later or soon. I would recommend you, if anyone's interested, can have a look, because there's far more detail than I can get through in a 10-ish minute talk. Ish.
Thanks a lot. Our final speaker is going to be Nick Pidgeon from Cardiff, and a special thanks. He was hoping to be here in person and has contracted COVID. So thanks a lot, and all the best for a speedy recovery. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, and I hope you can hear me all right. I should say, just first off, I've been watching yesterday and today, and thank you to Paul Dodds and the UKERC team who've organised this conference. I think it's run really smoothly, so you should take a lot of credit for that. And as I said, I'm sorry, I was absolutely ready to travel yesterday, then tested negative for COVID, which, ironically, having spent the last 2 years giving various government departments science advice on risk communication around the pandemic, I unwisely travelled to Edinburgh last week on a long train journey, and I really should have known better. But anyway, I was asked to talk about greenhouse gas removal and the ethical and societal questions, and it's something actually that perhaps some people in UK don't know. We've been working on in the research group for quite a while. Let's see if the clicker works. Yes, it does. So just looking at those, in fact, the top publication there, Geo Engineering Climate, Adam Corner and I published way back in 2010. That was a response to the Shepard report, the Royal Society report on geoengineering. And we felt at the time that that report had not sufficiently reflected some of the key social and ethical questions around greenhouse gas removal. So we've been looking at that really since. At the time, just to get the history right, and if you go back to the Shepherd report, you will see there were two approaches to geoengineering. One was solar radiation management. The most controversial technique would be placing stratospheric aerosols into the stratosphere to block sunlight coming into the Earth. And the other one was various carbon removal approaches, as we've heard more recently in analysis post-Paris. It was clear that there was a problem putting those two together. And I think at the time, even with radiation management and greenhouse gas removal, I sort of viewed this as studying science fiction, in effect, that this stuff was there. These were proposals in the science community, but they weren't actually the reality. Of course, since that time, there's been a very concerted attempt to separate the two approaches. So the radiation management is now talked about separately, and the greenhouse gas removal, particularly since Paris and the 1.5 degree target, has become much more prominent in policy discourse, as we've seen earlier. Now, at scale, it's interesting. You might just reflect when we come to the end of my talk, when you really think about it at scale, some of the issues that dog solar radiation management may also dog greenhouse gas removal. So I'll come back to that. So I'm drawing on these 4 publications. If you want a really potted sort of summary, this 4th one, the Delivering Net Zero, on our website, this is work with John Barrett and Mike Colchin for EPSRC. And there's a nice little briefing on some of the things I'm going to say and broadly what the landscape of greenhouse gas removal is. And I will say, negative emissions were not entirely science fiction at the time. We were writing that first paper in 2010. This is from our original, some work that we did for UKirk in 2011-12. We were using the My 2050 calculator, which was the school's version of the carbon calculator that David Mackay pioneered within DEC at that time. And what you see there is, and we observed using this with members of the public, and there's lots of papers we've written up about that use of the My 2050 tool, it was quite difficult to meet the carbon target, which was, as you see at the top, it was 80% at that point in time, without a lot of biofuels. I mean, a real lot of biofuels. And we were curious about that. And we wrote a little briefing, actually, document for DEC after we'd been using the My 2050 tool. And this is what we said. I won't read it out in detail, but just to say that, you know, heroic measures on the other sliders, nuclear power, particularly on the supply sliders, actually, nuclear, wind and others, were required to meet the target if you didn't have a lot of biofuels, which is interesting. And I remember David Mackay was quizzed at about that time at one of the Science Advisory Councils about whether negative emissions were in DEC's planning. And he sort of admitted, well, yes, they were, and they were there with biofuels. And you can see what we were talking about in terms of size. On the My 2050 tool, people who had to choose position 2 on the sliders were assuming, in terms of the description of what that slider meant, was biocrops covering an area the size of Wales in the UK and another area the size of Wales overseas. Of course, coming from Wales, that would, I'm sure, create some rather grumpy sheep if you had all those biocrops all across the whole landscape of Wales. I think it's important to bear that in mind because it brings home the scale of the issue we're talking about. We can talk a lot about units and measurements and how much, but actually we need a lot of it if we're doing serious sequestration. And the question then is where does that actually happen? So on the ethical questions, I'll skip through these quite quickly. They're in the various publications that we've got, so people can go and have a look at those. First thing, this is much more solar radiation management. If you think about CDR or greenhouse gas removal at scale, have we got a right to manipulate the biodiverse and global climate system? So have we got a right to mess with nature? And that's a fundamental question I don't think has been fully resolved. There are some blurred boundaries between mitigation and greenhouse gas removal at scale. So we can talk a lot about forestation. And what implications does that bring for governance? There's always been an assumption that greenhouse gas removal would require a different form of governance process. But if it's very similar to mitigation, then maybe, or if mitigation looks very similar to certain types of greenhouse gas removal, what types of governance process might we require that brought the two together? Third, there's the question of mitigation deterrence. Duncan McLaren and others at Lancaster talked a lot about this. Would reliance on greenhouse gas removal in the models give us a disincentive to engage in radical and deep carbon cuts on the mitigation side? So are we deterring mitigation? Generally, people don't think that's the case when you talk to members of the public, but they believe politicians will fall foul of that problem. Duncan McLaren also has argued, actually, we need to make a split. We shouldn't roll net zero removal targets in with mitigation targets. We need two completely separate targets, and then that potentially overcomes some of the problem of hiding, not doing enough mitigation in our net zero target, where we're assuming a lot of greenhouse gas removal. So I'll leave that one on the table. Markets, how can we organise finance for GGR at scale? Nobody really knows this, other than I think DEC and others have got caught on to the issue that it's monitoring, verification and reporting that's critical. And there's a big issue there for land-based, the sorts of things we're talking about today, land-scale-based greenhouse gas removal, because it's actually quite difficult to do the measurements. So there's a big challenge for the research community here. I think Rebecca has already talked about this, but I will just reinforce that one of the big things we need to talk about is ecosystems and communities, but communities in particular. That what will be the implications for local communities, farmers, villages, others, if we are radically transforming the agricultural system. So, and the point I made, just transitioned, it's not only about the old fossil fuel industry. And then finally, the one conflicts over land use for food, etc., which I think has been talked about in this area. Briefly, I'll give you a couple of slides from our own data. The original first UCAT project I was involved in, which was looking at public acceptance of whole energy system change, a part of that we had biofuels and CCS. And really what came out of our work with the public there was the idea of people saw it as a non-transition, by which I mean they saw it, it wasn't just a question of not burning stuff, although actually if you see on the quote here, I mean, I like this one, it seems like they just panicked and said we'll burn stuff. That's from the workshop in Cumbria. It was the idea that it was a backward step. It wasn't new technology, it wasn't going forward, it wasn't what we need in a sustainable world. So biofuels and CCS in particular have a particular issue around that, about whether they're sustainable in the long term. That then leads on to other more recent work we've done as part of the Leadingham Centre for Climate Change Mitigation, which is focusing upon a particular technology called enhanced rock weathering, which is a soil carbon sequestration technique. But here we did workshops both in the United States and the UK, looking at 3 potential GGR approaches, BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, enhanced weathering, and direct air capture. And I think the interesting thing about that was, which was different from what we'd found sort of 10 years ago in the original UCAT project, was that people obviously now, and we know this from other surveys, climate change is seen as urgent and immediate, but it raises a temporal dilemma for carbon removal and greenhouse gas removal approaches, because it's seen as simultaneously too long-term, i.e. it won't be ready in time given the urgency, and it's also simultaneously not long-term enough because it doesn't address the non-transition sustainability concerns. And we talked about that in this paper here for Nature Climate Change, this temporal dilemma that GGR has. The other important thing is, I mean, we talk a lot about public acceptance, social license to operate, but it's very important, but our view is always it's conditional acceptance, which is the key. So it's not what you do, it's how you do it. By which I mean, certainly that all of our work has shown, and the Climate Assembly showed as well, that people will sort of reluctantly go for certain types of greenhouse gas removal, but only conditional upon a very serious effort on mitigation. So the two are actually linked in that sense, that people won't accept lots of greenhouse gas removal if we're not taking mitigation seriously. So that was my final slide. I'm glad I haven't coughed too much during the whole of the presentation. There are a number of people who've worked, some really smart people who've worked with me on these projects over the years. So I acknowledge them. and a number of the papers there, which anybody can get from me if you drop me an email. So thank you very much.
To Nick. If I could invite the panellists to come back up and sit on the stools of peril, that would be wonderful. In case you don't know, my name's Gail Taylor, and I'm mostly based these days in the University of California, Davis, but I also hold a part-time post at University of Southampton. I've been interested in bioenergy for a few decades. Welcome everyone, and we've got Nick online, so that's great. Loads of questions coming in. If I could kick off with one which is sort of summarises a number of questions, which is really about land use in the UK, the big, very ambitious targets, and Rebecca showed some of the data on the land that will be required for bioenergy to fulfil our Committee on Climate Change projection. You know, some of the figures are 27,000 hectares a year for afforestation, 30,000 hectares a year for these bioenergy crops to reach our 800,000 target, which will enable us to have that 10 to 15% reduction in greenhouse gases for the UK. Is that really feasible? Is it going to happen? Given that we have less than 10,000 hectares in the ground and have done so for the last decade and a half?
Possible, yes. I mean, it seems like a lot, but we actually have a reasonable amount of agricultural land in the UK and a reasonable amount of upland area. I think it works out as about 1% of the total agricultural land area, including the grassland. We have a huge amount of grassland in the UK. I mean, that's the issue. Is actually people think of these they think of land and they think of wheat fields. We have a huge amount of land available if we start to include some of those sort of grassland areas. The issue is, and the CCC have done a lot of the calculations for me, so like I don't have to do them. That land is available without causing, without causing major impacts on things like food supply. I think the issue is getting it in the ground, and the getting it in the ground bit is around that economic balance and all the barriers we've discussed. I think feasibly you can get that much crop in the ground. We've done it with other crops. I mean, oilseed rape is kind of the area that we want for bioenergy crops, and that is actually a new crop in the UK. And it expanded rapidly because it did all the things that farmers wanted or landowners wanted. There was a market for it. It was economically viable. It fitted in with other cropping. Land use change is possible, but you have to get all the bits in place to get it to happen. And I think that's where the challenge is. I don't think it's about the amount of land. I think it's about getting the system in place and getting the social license to operate with the communities as well.
Any other comments on that? Patricia.
Say that, I think this needs to be seen in the context of other things as well. One of the presentations I was in this morning talked about doing other stuff too, like dietary change. Well, we produce a lot of red meat in the UK. That's where a lot of that grassland sits. If we are looking at a future where we're doing less of that, then we run the risk that farmers who are making a profit today in rural areas will not be able to do so in future. And while the price that we're paying at the moment for some of these crops would not make them profitable, it's having them produce something that's useful, something that's sequestering carbon and that's useful for the ecosystem. So I think there are opportunities to square this circle.
Another question linked to this was about current events, food security in the UK. The UK is about 65% food secure. That's increased in recent years. Is this the time to be investing land in these crops?
I think that it again depends on what you want. Food security is an issue at the moment. Actually, I think a lot of people are talking about Ukraine. They don't actually. The actual export of grain from that country is a very small portion of the actual total market of that crop, and it's a focus, but it's more a focus because of the cost of living, which is less related to food supplies. It's more related to energy supply. I think it's long term. If we don't tackle climate change, food security is going to be an issue anyway. So I think it's understanding it's the best use of that land, and that balance has to be had in terms of there isn't necessarily a competition between food and bioenergy crops. The competition is between what you're going to eat and those dietary requirements. If we all went vegan tomorrow, there'd be plenty of land available. And actually, we don't necessarily have too much of a food. There's still potential food surplus in this UK. We can still up the production on the land we have. And we could also, by intensification or various other means, it's about understanding what your target is. What are you actually attempting to achieve? I don't think it makes sense for the UK to go, personally, to go 100% food self-sufficient. It wouldn't be the most efficient way for us to produce our food. It would make no sense. I kind of see us as part of a global community, and that you grow the food where it makes most sense to do it, where it costs less in terms of carbon, and where you're getting the highest yields per hectare. So it doesn't make sense for us to try and be sufficient in crops that we can't grow here. And people don't want to eat grain and what we produce in the UK and potatoes. They want to eat avocados. So it makes no sense to push for 100% food security. And food security is about your ability to purchase food more than it is about your ability to grow it in your own country.
Maybe one for Oliver. It's about nets. Can they really be delivered? Where's the evidence that these nets can actually be delivered? That the IAMs are very good at sucking carbon out and optimizing, but where's the evidence for delivery? This gap we're all about.
That's a great question. It's developing. I think that first of all, it's important to understand that nets are a variety of very different technologies and very different pathways. So BECCS is a negative energy technology in that categorization, but BECCS itself is a supply chain for all the biomass being taken from one place to another, converted and supplied to a location where you're going to use it, but also the CCS technology that's required to capture the emissions and then pump it offshore. So when you talk about nets, you're talking about a lot of different scales of technologies and a lot of different categories of technologies. And I think we're starting to see the development of pieces of that puzzle. So thinking about BECCS, for example, and bioenergy, there's excellent work going into understanding all of the soil carbon related, growth related, yield related, where do we plant these crops, how do we grow them, what land do we need to use, what's the best use of that land. That knowledge is really developing. The CCS part of that supply chain for getting the negative emissions is in demonstration as well. Drax has said that they're thinking about demonstrating that. There's studies being put forward in industrial clusters across the UK, and people are starting to think about ramping up that part of it. The question is, from my perspective, are we going to be able in time to demonstrate that the whole supply chain can be fitted together and supply what we need it to supply to get there? And really, I think that the research and the demonstration, the innovation that Patricia was mentioning earlier on that's needed to get there, we need to get moving faster and faster while not waiting for it to deliver. Other things can be done whilst that is being developed and prepared, because we will require it, because 2050 isn't an end date anyway. So 2050 is a target that we have, but then sustainability beyond 2050 is something that we need to be thinking about as well. So whilst we're developing the innovation and demonstrating the pieces of this puzzle, we need to be thinking about every other thing that we can do to reduce the need that we're going to have for it in the future. So sidestepping that slightly.
There were a number of questions around the international dimension and the context of the UK within the international dimension. As many of you know, Drax imports a few million tons of biomass from the US, from my side of the pond, for decarbonisation. And the questions were around how much will the UK need to import? Is it sustainable? How can we ensure that it's equitable? So I don't know who wants to kick off. And what are the international policies? So Oliver.
I'll take a very quick stab at that, because it's something that I think, so Nick alluded to equity and elements relating to the UK and social license to operate in the UK. And I think that one thing that worries me slightly about international biomass supply is that whilst we're taking it from somewhere like the US, in a market that's not developing very fast and that we can control and understand well, then we're in a situation where we can monitor, verify, and report relatively easily. And I stress the word relatively. But when other countries, along with the UK, decide that this is something that's going to develop fast and the international market starts to grow, we need to have the knowledge that institutions in producing countries are capable of providing that same protection of individuals, communities, and societies locally where those crops are being produced. So think about Brazil, for example. Think about other tropical areas of the globe where we need to be able to demonstrate that the sustainability criteria we've developed that are being guaranteed by these countries, are we able to guarantee that those institutions and the system along the way actually provides the guarantees we have set in place? Can we be certain that that's being provided? At the moment, I'm not certain that's the case everywhere, and that's where I think the international sort of sustainability question from a perspective of people and communities is really quite important.
But I think that it was you, maybe, who mentioned earlier, or was it you, the monitor, verify, report system? And that is the only way that we're going to sort that out.
Absolutely key.
And one of the things here, I think, as well, is that the system we have at the moment relies on supply chains, and it relies on us saying, that came into the UK, it went to that power station, it came from that field, let's chase that down. I don't actually think that's what we're really worried about here. What we are worried about is what the larger scale impact is in a region of sourcing particular things. That's certainly the case, I think, in the US. It's definitely what I'm worried about in Brazil, which I have to say is the country in the world that I rank highest in terms of its level of environmental information on land use and what farmers are doing. So actually, the data is there. It's just all written in Portuguese, and we've got to get used to that. But you know, let's work on that. I think we need to work with international partners on this, because I think there's a reality here that there are parts of the world where it's good to grow stuff. That's why we buy avocados from elsewhere in the world. There's parts of the world where it's good to grow bio stuff. And there's parts of the world where it's good to store it. Oh yes, that would be the North Sea and things like that. We have to accept this is the world we live in. This is its geography, and it's our job to put the mechanisms in place that allow us to actually deliver that in a way that we can be confident. And for me, that's the monitor, verify, report.
I couldn't agree more. But I think that until we have the certainty that, certainty isn't a good word.
We'll never get certainty.
No, that's why it's not a good word. But until we are able to confidently implement a monitoring, verification and report system that we can roll out not just to Brazil but to other parts of the world where maybe that data doesn't exist and where maybe those institutions don't exist, then it's a significant risk.
It is a risk, but I'm going to come back to where I started my presentation, which is you manage risk by placing the risk with the party best able to deal with it and by incentivizing them to perform it. Then we monitor and verify. I'm not convinced the UK is best placed to deal with the patchwork of what's going on in sub-Saharan Africa, for example.
No, but I don't think sub-Saharan Africa is necessarily able to provide that either.
Joint collaboration, sorry.
Good question for global governance, which in my mind we haven't been very good at over the last 20 years, but you look at what we've actually achieved. But what this audience really wanted to know is how much do we need to import? So my view on that is the agricultural landscape in the UK is about 15 to 20 million hectares. We need up to 1 million hectares to make any impact with BECCS, and it seems pretty unlikely that we'll make even 50% of that unless we have government policy which incentivizes that market in some way, which has been completely flat. There hasn't been policy. As Rebecca showed, that if this isn't profitable, we incentivize it in different ways, and that's just completely absent from what I can see at the moment. So that leaves us with the consequence that these international sources of biomass, which can be sustainable, could be really important for the UK. There's a question here for Nick, actually, about rural communities, and you started to answer it, but what's the unintended consequences or the trade-offs for rural communities if we see this big change in landscape? And it has both a UK and an international context.
Yeah, okay, well, I would think in the UK context. Here's a good example. And I think there are many of them, and this is an understudied issue. Let's put it this way. A number of us have sort of been looking at public views on greenhouse gas removal, and from a much more sort of abstract perspective, let's put it this way, what would this mean for the country as a whole if we did this? But it really, deployment comes down to what happens in the village near you. So a good example would be in rural Mid Wales. Already there is a controversy boiling up over large city institutions buying up Welsh farms in order to then put conifers or whatever trees on they want to offset carbon. And that's fine on the basis of a single farm maybe, but if it happened repeatedly, then you may have less farms. If you have less farms, you have less communities. potentially, and if you have less communities, you have less Welsh language. And that, I know that's kind of a long chain, but you're actually lighting a fire which is extremely sensitive. Let's put it no more than that. So I think that's one example. That's why we need, I think, more research on this, because you need to do quite close ethnography, as we would talk about it as social scientists, in some of the communities where these proposals are likely to occur. Can I just make one point on the governance as well? I mean, I think with Geo Engineering, there's been a thought that you had to have governance in place before deployment. I think that's one of the comments that was made a long time ago. And so I don't think this can be a purely market-led approach. I think there has to be a set of international agreements in place as well before we start really importing in bulk material from other countries. So anyway, thank you.
Thanks. There was a question around offsetting risk, that the government could have a role in being the main buyer of nets to offset the risk, bootstrap markets, or should they just get out of the way? What's the perception of that?
People are looking at me. I'm going to caveat this by I'm not an economist. So should the government step in and play a role or get out of the way? So I think we've heard today that one of government's fundamental roles is to provide certainty and to provide a direction of travel that is clear and transparent. And I think in that sense, we definitely need that role to be fulfilled. So if government does anything, I think it would be that agreeing with all the parties involved what the regulations that are required are, what they look like, who they're going to apply to, and how they're going to be rolled out in the future. Guarantee, you were talking, Rebecca was talking about price security for farmers involved in these schemes in the UK. So providing that security and that knowledge that the policy framework is not going to change, I think is their role. I think that maybe people working in the industrial sector or in power sector and all of these elements would argue that their role is to figure out how the capture is going to work and how the sequestration is going to work and how that should be put together with the government providing that framing, that certainty of framing for policy. That would be my general view. I think the more the government tries to get involved in some of these things, maybe the slower things might get.
I think I would probably agree. And there was two aspects in that workshop around incentives. Ones were people saying, oh, we need incentives to get the crop off the ground, and the other people saying they don't work, and actually we'd rather the government literally do, get out of the way. So I think that framework in terms of setting what is the desired level of carbon sequestration, so setting the rules basically to make the playing field, but then probably getting out of the way in terms of how that's implemented, providing that's it's about that reporting. As long as you have the system in place to make sure that you're achieving your aims, there's an argument for getting out of the way and letting the industry and the growers and the farmers sort out how they get there. Changes in policy are the worst possible thing to do. This constant, sort of start an incentive, realise it's not doing what you want, take it away again. That's very, very damaging. So.
There is a role, surely, as we talked about earlier, around setting public confidence on sustainability, particularly we're looking at imports. And well, yeah, the rules, but it's verifying that people are playing within the rules, and I still think that must sit at state level.
I think it should. I've often wondered whether an independent, so talking about monitoring, verification and reporting, one of the ways to foster trust around that is to make sure that it's removed from the people who have other involvements in the system. And I kind of feel whether there's a missing piece there that would be around, whether national, so that would be a role for domestic and international potentially.
I agree.
Institutions that would be an independent provider of that trust.
Great. There are many other questions, but maybe we could finish on this last one as it's lunchtime. There are some questions around, we're putting a lot of faith in these nets which don't actually exist, and where is the investment needed and the research from government or other agencies to ensure that we are successful? What investment is required? How's that going to happen?
I'm getting a nudge again.
That's not the easy question.
No. So I'm not sure is the honest answer to that one. I think that going back to to the root of that question that is around, the sheer scale and reliance on nets. I think a lot needs to be done on technologies that exist. So one of the things that we talked about today was, house refurbishments, 1 per minute, and that I think was a few years ago. So there are a lot of things that we can be doing to reduce the pressure on the system and to reduce the need for those technologies in the future. In parallel to that, I think that we have the bodies in place, the super gens in place. We have research communities ready with solutions ready to start rolling out the next phase of research and development on each of the pieces that we need of the puzzle. I think it's providing more support to those.
I mean, one of the specific questions was, what biomass conversion technologies that was more specifically because, biomass is rather unique in that it can go off in these different directions. So
I'm going to nudge along.
Well, to Patricia, where should coming from the US, I know what we're doing: aviation fuel, aviation fuel, aviation fuel. Where should we be investing?
Low carbon gas, because we, as was shown earlier today, have a huge gas pipework infrastructure. If we want speed in terms of decarbonising, particularly domestic sector, that's where it's going to hit. Whether that gas is hydrogen, I would suggest at industrial centres and at ports, but elsewhere is a syngas or substitute methane. I don't think much matters as long as it's low carbon. I think there were 10 projects, demonstrators funded last week by BEIS on BECCS to hydrogen, and that is the direction that I think we need to head.
Great.
Can I come in?
Yes,
well?
Nick, do.
Sorry, I was going to mention as well, there's an interesting sort of sting in the tail of this. BBS, RC and NERC do have, of course, their greenhouse gas removal demonstrator program, and that is across 5 technologies, and they're all broadly land use and nature-based approaches. But if you look, I think the net zero strategy was mentioned yesterday. If you look in there, BEIS have put in about, we put in about 100 million to net carbon removal, greenhouse gas removal, of which 30 million is the demonstrators on the land use side. But the other 70 million is going to DACs, direct air capture. And my understanding is it's because they think it's more easily measurable. And therefore, let's bet on DACs. Now, we might have a little discussion about that, because those of us in the room who believed for many years that actually land use change, ecosystem restoration is a really important part of the net zero equation, might be slightly worried by, I don't know if anybody in BEIS is in the room to answer that one, but it is an interesting, given that DACs is only one among 6 or 7 or 8 potential candidates, it is getting quite a lot of funding starting to be put in its way. Thank you.
Any other comments on that? I do think that's a really interesting juxtaposition, land versus technology in a way. I'd like to thank all of the speakers and for their presentations and their discussion, and for Rob for chairing, and for everyone for participating. Thank you all very much.